Using art as expression can be a very powerful tool. Artists have been doing this for centuries upon centuries for many different reasons, including speaking out, educating an audience, and creating narratives. Narratives are found in art all over the world, whether in plain sight or hidden within. Nicholas Hlobo, a South African artist, creates narratives from found objects that portray his sexual identity, his culture, and ethnic identity. Each and every piece of material he uses in his work is a significant part of the narratives he creates. His art revolves around his identity and masculinity, and the changing international discourse of art remain at the core of his work. Also, many of the narratives within his work are about his South African heritage. Nicholas Hlobo was born in Cape Town, South Africa in 1975 and grew up in Transkei, South Africa. He is a part of the Xhosa culture, a South African cultural group who practice tradition and emphasize and practice customs inherited from their forefathers. Hlobo graduated from Johannesburg Technikon Witwatersrand in 2002 with a degree in fine art. He is currently still living in Johannesburg. Hlobo has done many solo exhibitions at institutions, including the SCAD Museum of Art in 2019, Locust Projects in Miami in 2013, the National Museum of Art, Architecture and Design in Oslo in 2011, the Level 2 Gallery at Tate Modern London in 2008, and the Boston ICA as part of the Momentum series in 2008, and many others. One of the many traditions still practiced among the Xhosa culture occurs right after giving birth. The mother is expected to stay inside of her house for 10 days. The umbilical cord and afterbirth are buried or burned to protect the baby from sorcery. At the end, a goat is sacrificed. Another common tradition practiced is male and female circumcision. The males in training live in huts isolated from the villages for about 3 weeks. Their heads are shaved, they wear loincloth, and white clay is smeared all over their bodies. Female circumcision involves being secluded for a week, dancing, and sometimes ritual sacrifices of animals. There is no actual surgical operation involved. In Hlobo's work, ribbons represent the feminine, while leather represents the masculine. There are many more traditions that are still practiced among the Xhosa culture that are portrayed in Hlobo's work. As queer theory started taking place in the United States, South Africa was in the process of rethinking national identity to conciliate the conflicting cultures that would become part of its democratic state. Since the late 90s, South Africa has overflowed with artworks from queer and national sensibilities. These artists view queer nationalism by attempting to complicate the representations of power that have historically sought to portray South Africa as a cohesive white nation. Most South African contemporary art revolves around this unresolved history of sexual politics due to a queer nationalist interest in ambiguity and inconsistency of meaning. Hlobo's work fits into this description of queer South African contemporary art, for it consists of narratives involving sexual identity, gender, and culture. One of Nicholas Hlobo's more famous exhibitions is Sewing Saw. Sewing Saw is about highlighting the violence central to renewal. The narrative here is represented by incorporating the concepts of sewing and sawing. Hlobo reflects on how builders, carpenters, and seamstresses have to use destruction as a precursor to creation. Performance art was also incorporated into this exhibition. Walking into the room, one would see 3 very tall sets of a table and 1 chair with sewing machines sitting on those tables. Men are sitting in the chairs using the sewing machines. They are draped with a white transparent cloth hanging from the ceiling. The men are sewing blue, red, and black large pieces of cloth together. Surrounding them are a small table and 2 more sewing machines. There are different colored strings and ribbons on or around these objects. Hlobo states, if we take self-inventory, the endeavor here needs to be focused mainly on dealing with the grotesque. If we were to go into ourselves, go inside, we're not as beautiful as we look on the outside. In real truth, inside we're all cords, plugs, and connecting points, some split, some broken. Yet the body mends itself, the body continually grows. It's a never-ending process. It's a progression, and the mind does the same. One of the sculptures within the Sewing Saw exhibition is titled Insimbi and Lesnai, which represents the saw. In English, this translates to the metal that devours other metals. This statement or saying is used by the Xhosa people to illustrate the power of God. Nsimbi Endinsli also refers to an uncertain deity, protected, impervious, and vulnerable. The performative installation that represents sewing is titled Umbuvuzo, the Parable of the Sower. The performers are seated at the tall tables using the sewing machines, mending fabrics together. The men are viewed as cultivating the tilling of the earth, necessary, fruitful, and labored. This exhibition reflects Hlobo's repudiation of the absolute and allows viewers to create their own narratives and draw their own conclusions. Ngubo Yazui is another one of Hlobo's famous sculptural pieces. Ngubo Yazui translates to clothes or blanket of the nation, which refers to the Xhosa ritual where cowhide is used to cover a corpse before burial to protect the deceased as they enter the afterlife. The sculpture contains hundreds of small pieces of leather and rubber sewn together to make one large animal-like form. The animal form represents the slaughtering of the cow used in the ritual. Significant moments in people's lives are often marked by the slaughtering of a cow. Often in his work, the leather is used to represent traditional Xhosa practices and traditions, while rubber is used to signify modernization. The rubber and the leather seem perfectly intertwined together, but the narrative is seen by the spilling out of the cords and fabrics in different parts of the sculpture, which is a visual representation of the slaughter of the cow. Cattle is very important within the Xhosa culture. Wealth is measured by the size of a man's herd, and men are only able to marry once they have a sufficient amount of cattle to pay bride wealth to their future father-in-laws. One of his works, titled Taiafaka, which means ball with water, or eye in English, is made of rubber tubing with ribbon spewing out of the form. The form, made of rubber and ribbon, resembles a beached whale. It looks as if the whale's body is covered in debris on the shore. This in itself is a rich metaphor for surrender to the elements over which we have no control, Hlobo states. Taiafaka is a play on the idea that things can be submerged or brought up from below the surface. This may be extended into our personal lives and the lack of control we have over things and people coming in and out of our lives, like the tides and the impact these elements have on our lives over time, Hlobo discusses. Nicholas Hlobo also creates very detailed two-dimensional work along with his sculptural and performance work. They often resemble body parts or cell-like shapes and are made from colorful pieces of fabric that are sewn into the paper. Ianco translates to a buckle from a belt in English. It could also relate to a geological chain or family tree. This work consists of light pink and off-white ribbon with black rubber. The ribbons form chain-like shapes in a diagonal line going across the paper. In the upper left-hand corner, the chain stops to form a three-dimensional shape that resembles a plug hole. In the middle of the page, there is a small piece of black rubber held tight by pink ribbons. Hlobo used his signature baseball stitch to hold the rubber and ribbons together on the paper. He uses the baseball stitch in most of his work to keep things in place since the stitch is very strong. The seam or suture in South Africa is a metaphor meaning inequality or conflict. This is another very important reason Hlobo uses stitching in his work, relating back to the narratives he creates. Makaleni in Tazamlabo is another one of Hlobo's two-dimensional pieces. Makaleni in Tazamlabo refers to a Xhosa tradition where the boys would throw rocks into the river before diving in naked as a sign of respect towards the river. They also do this to acknowledge that they are visitors in a space that is not their own. The narrative here lies within the material and form of the work. A tea stain forms an organic shape on the watercolor paper. Hlobo used orange, red, off-white, pink, and olive green colored ribbons to sew an outline around the tea stain. Of course, he did this using his signature baseball stitch. In the middle of the tea stain, there are two circles side by side, not covered in tea, that resemble eyes. The tea stain shape resembles an underwater creature. The slippery surface and warm skin-colored tones represent sexual connotations that are explained by the title of the work. In my work, I explore Xhosa traditions or African traditions and gender issues, with an emphasis on masculinity and rituals. When I thought of making an artwork that is particularly masculine, I decided to make a kraal, but also to challenge the purpose of the kraal, states Hlobo. A kraal is a space where cattle is kept and rituals take place within the Xhosa culture. When boys go to their final graduation, they go to the kraal to be introduced back into the family. They also go to the kraal to get advice from older men about how to carry themselves, now since they are growing up. The kraal is also a space that symbolizes wealth, so if someone has a bigger kraal, that means they are wealthy. The sculpture is made of exotic wood, standing up in a circle so people can enter. There is a pink net of ribbons surrounding the wood. The stakes have a rhythm that was influenced by the ground on which they were built. On one side, they are almost upright, but on the other side, they are leaning. They resemble people who are watching over what is happening here. They are like spectators of this game, keeping guard on everything inside the kraal, Hlobo describes. Amenaba, which translates to limbs of the vine or grapevine in English, is Hlobo's largest two-dimensional work on paper. The title refers to different pathways or vines, gossip travels, and explores the process of communication within the human race. The stitches are more chaotic and denser than those seen in his other works. They are attached to a piece of rubber at the bottom of the paper. The lines on the paper are jagged and going in different directions, which is how the work is meant to be. The narrative is seen when the ribbons and stitches cross paths, like people do in life. The paths are meant to cross, intersect, and even create dead ends to reflect interactions made by humans. Sketching and documenting the process of a piece of art is crucial in the making process and outcome of a piece. Every artist goes through some sort of brainstorming or documentation process. Nicholas Hlobo creates visual diaries before starting his final work. These visual diaries are his form of documentation and brainstorming. Hlobo usually has a large piece of fabric hanging on a wall in his studio that he uses to document his work. It's filled with stitching, different colored ribbon, drawings, and much more. Hlobo uses this piece of fabric to sketch out ideas for performance outfits, measurements for sculptures and other parts of the exhibition, and materials he wants to use. Although the visual diaries are used pretty freely, Hlobo documents his notes in the Xhosa language, so there is a bit of privacy there. These diaries are very personal records documenting Hlobo's artistic journey leading up to an exhibition. Nicholas Hlobo creates narratives through mesmerizing sculptures, performances, and two-dimensional works. His artwork portrays his sexual identity, his Xhosa culture, and ethnic identity through the use of different materials. The materials he uses, rubber, ribbons, wood, leather, fabric, and found objects, often refer to his Xhosa culture and common traditions within Xhosa culture. The use of leather means masculinity and the use of ribbon means femininity. Ribbon and leather are seen in almost every one of his pieces, which means they are relating to some part of his sexual identity or traditions involving gender of his culture. Hlobo never lets a piece of material go to waste and makes sure every single piece of his project has meaning and a narrative.